Good afternoon, everybody. It's lovely to see so many of you here and actually to have so much representation from those institutions that actually completed the survey that's really helped to inform our report this afternoon. So my thanks is very much extended to you on behalf of myself and Rebekah, and of course the whole council and wider sector across the UK and Ireland. So as Doug said, we're going to take this in turns a little bit. So I will be speaking first, and then Rebekah will come in a little bit later. And what we really just wanted to do was to give you, I guess, to start with a little bit of background and context as to what has got us to this point, really. So a little bit of the story so far. Is detailed here. So the first UKCGE report looking at graduate school structures was way back in 1994, actually, and those reports sought to track the significant changes in postgraduate education in the UK through the formation and development of the graduate school and alternative structures. And what it's done over those years is to do a comparator of changes in postgraduate education and the structures that support them. In 2015, the report was born very much out of a UKCGE working group that was looking at the ideas and conversations specifically focused on those structures that supported doctoral education. And so we began to explore in a little bit more detail what those structures were looking like, how they were starting to emerge, their remit, and also their priorities. And so, sensing that there was a little bit of a shift in the focus of universities both in the UK and Ireland, we wanted to form that 2015 report very specifically on those structures that support doctoral education. What we identified from the 2015 report was three very distinct phases in the establishment and growth of those structures, which are detailed here. So that has been the establishment of the graduate school, the consolidation and regulation of quality of those graduate schools and the services that they provide, and then also the collaboration and diversification of those models. Bringing us then to the 2021 survey, we wanted to continue on that focus of tracking PGR changes since the 1994 report. We wanted there to be that consistent, I guess, focus and historical documenting of what's been happening within UK and Irish institutions since that time. And then also to explore the expansion of the synergies between UK and Irish HEIs in the support and approaches to doctoral education. We also then wanted to reflect on the findings and the predictions and policy changes since the 2015 report, to then actually look at the strategic ambitions of the institutional vision. So just to note that the survey had ethical approval from Nottingham, Trent University. It was hosted on an online surveys.ac.uk and utilised some very similar questions to what had been in the 2015 report, and then also the reports prior to that, to act as a comparator between those different surveys. It was distributed to all UKCGE members across the UK and Ireland, and then followed up with individual requests to institutions, including non-member institutions. We then followed that up with some desk-based research on non-responding university utilising website and HESA data. So where we have utilised website data and HESA data, we have caveated that within the report itself to demonstrate where we have been reliant upon that desk-based research. Altogether, we had a 43% response rate, indicating that 74 institutions responded to the survey. The key areas that we wanted to identify were then also around the existence of the graduate school and doctoral college, strategic priorities and key performance indicators, growth of PGR, and then also looking at the EDI policy and priorities. So as we indicated, that there's a lot of content in this report. You can see here some highlights of the themes that run throughout the report, and what we've been able to do is identify a fourth phase in the growth and development of structures supporting doctoral education. That is that continuation and development of policy and practice in collaboration within those structures. So what we're going to talk about today are these key areas really, and as Doug indicated, there will be opportunity to discuss those additional areas during the Q&A session towards the end of the presentation. So if we move on now to some of the headline results, so these are the key areas that came out of the survey and the analysis, and as you will see from the first infographic on here, the significant growth in structures that support doctoral education since the 1994 survey. So that growth from 38% through to 75%. When we took out excluding specialist colleges, that then increases to 80%. We've then also seen a very significant shift in the organisational scope of those graduate schools and doctoral colleges, where now the distinct majority, so 81% of those responding institutions and from desk-based research, has their graduate school or the discrete structure based at an institutional level. So there's been a much greater increase with having that one institutional organisational unit that supports those structures, and witnessing a much decreased proportion of graduate schools that sit within individual areas of university, so at departmental level, faculty or at school. We've also then seen, in terms of the structural types, that the graduate school is still the predominant model, and so throughout the report we do continue to refer to those structures as graduate schools. But what we have witnessed as well is that there has been an expansion and growth of different nomenclature, so doctoral college, doctoral academy, doctoral school, as well as other terminology as well that's used to support those structures. What was a very key bit of data that we were certainly quite interested in exploring was that remit of who's in and who's out, and this is where we saw a very key difference from the 2015 report, but also saw that there were some very similar trends between Irish and UK institutions, particularly for the remit of Masters by Research and early career researchers, but then also in the free text responses, where respondents indicated that a lot of the growth in their remit was to support supervisors and supervisory training. So as we can see, that there's been a growth in responses where ECR support is now up from 17% to now 41%. And now 27% of responding institutions also now support the research staff. What was probably the most significant in this question was the decrease in support for postgraduate taught provision. So whereas the 2015 report indicated that 53% of responding institutions supported PGT, that this is reduced significantly to now only 9%. Looking at the full-time equivalent of support in graduate schools, as demonstrated here, and just for reference for those that want to refer to it in the report, this is at table 7. The survey responses also indicated that there was no specific relationship between the number of postgraduate researchers within that institution and the full-time equivalents within those responding institutions. There was a greater full-time equivalent, it appeared, and this was due to a more integrated and larger support infrastructure within those institutions. Whereas by comparison, those with a smaller number of FTE was when support was dispersed across the institution. So, for example, that support might have been in faculties, research centres at school level, etc. So it was I suppose, more centralised versus localised support. And as you can see from this table, the highest proportion of respondents indicated that their full-time equivalent support was between 6 and 10. We're also quite interested in looking at the leadership of graduate schools and doctoral colleges across Ireland and the UK. And what we see here at table 8 is that the predominant leadership model comes from a director role rather than a dean, and that is typically at a full-time equivalent. We did observe that there was some variation in leadership and then the pattern across those different institutions. So directors provide leadership for 77% of responding institutions with populations less than 1,000 in terms of their PGR enrolment. But then we also saw that the size of the PGR population didn't always necessarily correlate with the full-time equivalent of the leadership within those structures. We then started to look at the strategic priorities, and this is where we can start to see where the priorities have shifted since the 2015 report, which was where we were particularly interested in being able to track how that has changed over the last 6 to 7 years. And respondents were asked to indicate from 16 areas that were put to them, which were their institution's top 5 strategic priorities. And in the 2015 report, there was sufficient difference between graduate schools and doctoral colleges. So that's the diagram on the left. So we plotted one against the other. What we saw in the 2021 survey was that that difference had disappeared. And so those institutional structures had been identified. What was particularly interesting with looking at these priorities was that equity, diversity and inclusivity didn't appear as a top 5 priority, but did appear as a separate priority in itself, which we will come on to talk about a little later in the presentation. So what we can see from the survey response is that health and wellbeing has become present over the last 6 years. PGR experience has become a significant priority, as well as supervision. Funding in health and wellbeing are also new top priorities, and what we're starting to see through this bit of data is setting the scene of that more people-centred approach to doctoral colleges and graduate schools. And then, as we will discuss again later further in the presentation, that emergence of that people-centred thinking, not just in terms of the priorities, but then also in the policy that's being set. So in terms of the least ranked priorities, these are the ones that came in the bottom 5, and there might be some areas of interest with respect to these in terms of the UKRI consultation for New Deal for PGR, particularly for those of you that have looked at it yet, where the New Deal for PGR consultation does have a specific interest in understanding about societal engagement and also industry partnerships, which we will go on to discuss a little bit later. Respondents were then also asked to look at the most common activities where there was a high level of involvement from graduate schools and the discrete structures. And so what we're seeing in these figures is that we continue to see that people-centred approach that we highlighted in the previous slides. And as we go through the survey responses and in our analysis, particularly around improving the PGR experience, representing the PGR population, championing things that are important to the doctoral community, seeking their opinions and things, that very much runs as a theme throughout the through the responses, through our analysis, and when we're looking at not only the priorities, activities, but then also the measurables that I use to evaluate doctoral education, which is then identified here. So areas where graduate scores and similar structures metrics are used to measure effectiveness. What we did note is that nobody was actually assessing the quality of PGR supervision, and again picked up that diversity is a measurable but not a 5 priority. But then areas such as the postgraduate research experience survey, submission and completion measures were often used as a proxy for measuring supervision, but nothing specific was there to measure quality on a standalone item. So turning now to equity, diversity and inclusivity. So again, while EDI was not in the top 5 priorities, what we did start to see was that it was being identified as an area of importance in its own right. And so we thought that this was perhaps an indication that this is being embedded in the ways of working, rather than being that standalone item that we've just discussed. So here at table 13 of the report, we look at the most frequently collected data amongst respondents, and as we can see, that gender and ethnicity in application data of PGR is probably the most commonly collected area of data, whereas there are low levels of data being collected for the EDIs for things around completion metrics, submission metrics and progression. I will now hand you over to Rebekah, who will continue to talk about completion and submission rates. Thank you.
Thanks, Carolyn. I now have the challenge of driving the PowerPoint and speaking to the slides. So let's see how that goes. So when we look at completion time, what we saw was a trend towards shortened completion times. So over the past 5 years, we can see that almost 45% of the responding institutions said that their completion times had decreased. We've got, it's more or less, it's a kind of an even split, but slightly in favour of a 4 to 5 year window. So remembering that completion times includes the examination process as well. So imagine someone takes 4 years and they hand in, and then that last bit is just waiting to go through the examination process and making the corrections. One thing that we did is kind of find worthy, I suppose, of noting is that there was no difference across mission groups or across size of PGR populations in terms of average time to completion. So you can see from this slide that more or less we've got a sort of parity between institutions with fewer than 1,000 postgraduate researchers and those that had more than 1,000, which is more or less the split between pre and post 92 universities. One of the things that really kind of stood out, I guess, in terms of responses to questions was the response around aspirations to growth in the postgraduate researcher community. And that was one of the first kind of headline findings that we released about this report. So almost all the responding institutions were planning growth across their research degree portfolio, including MRes, which is quite interesting also. And the mean growth that was aspired to was 53% over the next 5 years, with the median at 27.5%. So there was a couple of outliers that sort of skewed the percentage a little bit. They were looking for, really significant uplift in their postgraduate research numbers. But, virtually everyone without exception who responded to the survey was aspiring to growth. And then when we think about, well, okay, so we asked the question, how are you going to achieve that growth? So the development of new programs and you know, campus-based programs, yes, but actually this kind of growth in interest in distance programs, which I think we might attribute in part at least to some of the quick learning that we all did as a result of the pandemic. And then also sort of thinking about some of the changes that we needed to make in response to this Brexit, and the idea that we were going to, you know, we needed to change up our offer and review how we were attracting some of our postgraduate researchers onto our programs. I think the professional doctorates kind of response is an interesting one. So you'll be aware that the most recent HEPI report that sort of mentioned professional doctorates talked about a steep decline in professional doctorates, and there's never been great data about how, because of some quirks on how we as institutions report in the UK on our professional doctorates. But it looks like we're sort of spotted a little bit of a bounce, at least in interest in the professional doctorate space. And I think I'll come on at the end of the presentation to just flag a little bit of inequity in terms of how we categorise professional doctorates and what that means in terms of access to funding for them. Because in the light of some of the things that we're trying to do and the policy drivers around engaging different communities and different groups of people and bringing them into doctoral research, professional doctorates might be a really good way to diversify the programme portfolio and attract a wider range of individuals. So I think there are some things to think about and some things to look at there. So just a quick recap so far. So I think key findings really, there's a little bit about the name. I think there's always a question about, does it matter what we call this unit that takes care of all of our postgraduate researchers? I think, it's interesting. What we saw in 2015 was almost that the graduate school was sort of on a terminal nosedive, and that it was all about, doctoral something, doctoral colleges at that time. I think that's kind of plateaued a little bit. And as Carolyn mentioned, we continue to use graduate school as the umbrella term, because it's still slightly ahead in terms of how we call these units, but actually there's an increasing number of different names for them. I think mostly it's kind of edging up towards researcher, so doctoral, and then the kind of step on from that being researcher. And I think that speaks to a change in remit as well, which we'll also mention. There's been quite a bit of kind of stripping out of some of the kind of multiple layers of structures that take care of doctoral candidates and postgraduate researchers more generally. So now really very much the majority sitting at an institutional level. PGT support through through graduate schools or equivalent has continued to decline in UK and in Ireland. But we've got this expansion in remit. So PGT are sort of dropping off the bottom, but then there's that kind of extension up. In some instances to early career researchers, and then in a smaller number but still growing number of cases kind of expanding out into research staff as well. And again, we'll highlight that as something we might want to explore in further detail and have more of a think about, particularly given some of the policy drivers around the people in research and a people-centered approach, and kind of changes that we as a sector want to make in terms of research culture, and whether we can do that most effectively, perhaps, if is a graduate school the right location to be joining up those two pieces in terms of training and development for researchers from PhD all the way through to professor. And then, yeah, as I said, this kind of shifting priorities towards the experience, whether you call postgraduate researchers students or not, I think is a point up for debate, but certainly that kind of the student experience approach, I guess, and this people-centered approach to how we support postgraduate researchers. So looking then looking at the drivers for change. So these two tables, one of them summarises the main internal drivers for change that were reported, and the other one is the main external drivers. So if we just look at the top three, I think in the free text responses as well, in the survey, a lot of responding institutions reported that they'd undergone an institution reorganisation, and their graduate school or equivalent, you know, as part of was part of that, and that was very, very common response. So that would have happened since the last report, that PGR recruitment was driving some of the changes, I think, which is unsurprising given the aspirations that were reported to, you know, quite significant growth in postgraduate researcher populations. And then I think, you know, this idea of how do we better support and enable trans, cross and interdisciplinary research, which is a sort of a response to the policy driver around challenge-led research and maybe the place-based research agenda to some extent. And then looking at the external drivers, so obviously changes in national and international policy, mental health and well-being. So as Carolyn said, that really has come out of nowhere in the last 6 years, and that's been policy-led. And then institutions, I think, have sort of followed the policy driver on that. But also similarly, I think, in terms of equality, diversity and inclusion. So where there've been these policy changes that relate to this kind of people-centered idea of how do we get all different kinds of people into research, and then how do we support them to be great researchers. That's kind of driven this need to address equality, diversity and inclusion, and that's kind of brought about change at an institutional level, and I think from the free text responses we got continues to do so, and we can talk a little bit more about that later if that's useful. So this is the last slide, and really what Carolyn and I wanted to do was just leave you with some kind of thoughts, some of our thoughts, some areas that we might discuss further as part of this webinar, or, you know, some things that you might be talking about in your own institutions, or bringing back to your own institutions for further discussions. So these were really things that came up from the policy analysis. There's a section on that, both national and international in the report, but also in the data that we collected in the survey findings. So I think in terms of collaboration, there is potential to expand programmes that are co-funded with business, industry, third sector partners. Cross-sector collaboration was certainly highlighted as an area for further development. In sort of from a policy perspective, both in Ireland's review of Ireland's higher education research system, which was published last year, and the UK's PGR New Deal. And, you know, there are EDI, there are employability, and there are knowledge exchange kind of reasons for why we want to foster and grow these collaborations. And almost 90%, so 89% of the survey respondents reported that most or all of their supervisory teams already included an element of cross-institutional or cross-organisation supervision. So it's already happening to some extent, but there was a clear desire for collaboration to be made easier. So it's institutions, graduate schools, we're still finding it really difficult to enable some of these collaborations. So from a practical sense, there's a lot of work to do there. So I think this raises questions around collaboration can be best enabled. There's a further question also around whilst internationalisation and partnership working with external partners, business, industry, third sector, that's an objective for some universities, and it's driven by policy. There was very little evidence that the knowledge and expertise and capacity required to develop these activities was located within graduate schools or equivalent structures. So it's fine, you know, maybe there's great links and great collaborations with other parts of universities that are bringing in this, that are, you know, sort of contributing this expertise. But I wonder if this is such an area for growth, whether there is something worth looking at about whether those relationships are working effectively, or whether graduate school or equivalent structures need to develop some specialist expertise in collaborations in a doctoral context, if that, where that doesn't already exist. And it didn't seem like that was often within a graduate school remit. Thinking about modes of delivery, so we've had the development of blended and online delivery in very short order, expedited by COVID mainly, but also Brexit possibly. But there's probably a lot more thinking that needs to be done about the positive and the negative impacts of blended and online delivery. So what's the impact for certain groups? Are we opening it up to some groups, so making doctoral education more accessible, but at the same time creating kind of other issues around mental health and well-being and isolation, access to peer support, and that kind of engagement with the research culture and research environment, which always scores, you know, much lower than we would hope in PGR surveys like PRES, so postgraduate research experience survey, for example. So if we grow online provision, which I think, you know, the survey findings showed that there's a lot of institutions interested in doing that, what's that going to mean for the wider research culture? And how has the wider research culture already been affected by new working practices amongst staff as well as postgraduate researchers? And thinking about well-being, so it's a clear strategic priority for many graduate schools who responded to the survey, but some of those levers that would really help to support the well-being amongst postgraduate researcher community, they're not within the gift of graduate schools or equivalent. So thinking specifically about space, so a nice kind of social space to mix, study space. Graduate schools don't always have control over that. And also social activities. So social activities did not come up frequently as a sort of major activity for where graduate schools had responsibility. And then also the question came up around form and format of the doctorate. So this could link to one of the desires highlighted in the PGR New Deal consultation, to consider different types and styles of doctorate in order to address underrepresentation at doctoral level of certain groups. So I think there's a consideration about what kind of mechanism at sectoral level would enable the types of discussions that would be required to explore this in fully. Employability, I think, although career development's reported as a top 5 strategic priority, few of the respondents reported high levels of involvement in the delivery of careers related support, and so such as kind of providing career information and monitoring destination data. So this is likely delivered by career services directly. But given the importance of employability, again, I suppose it's a similar question to the one around collaborations. Is there a value, would there be a value in developing more or greater or a specialist support that was specific to the postgraduate research community in terms of employability? And then training, just thinking about, so we had this great quote from one of the respondents, you may be on the call, I don't know. Institutions can work smarter together in coordinating more cross-institutional delivery of training and development for postgraduate researchers outside of funded consortia. So some of the potential in blended and online delivery could be, you know, there's a potential there that could be exploited to raise the kind of quality and breadth of training for everybody at a sectoral level if we really got to grips with that. But do we have an appetite to get to grips with that? And then obviously that has a bearing on some of the equality, diversity and inclusion issues also. That sort of brings us to equitable access to funding. And I think access to funding for studentships was reported as a top 3 issue in the free text responses from all institutions to questions on the impacts of COVID-19 and what respondents considered the major challenges in doctoral education to be currently and then also in the next 5 years. So it's a subject, I mean, funding is always a subject that's high on the agenda, but changes to funding was the top response to questions about what national development in doctoral education respondents would like to see in the next 10 years. So in the UK, the data increasing involvement in funded training partnerships of post-92 universities. What we saw in the data was that those studentships awards that are still very much clustered in research intensives. So although we have the partnerships, we've got more new universities involved in those kind of funded collaborations. They're not, the funding isn't yet necessarily following that sort of more inclusive approach. So there's arguably some more work to do there, particularly thinking, you know, with an EDI lens around access to doctoral education. What the data shows us is that the post-92 universities have much higher rates of postgraduate researchers from racialized groups, for example, and high rates of postgraduate researchers with disabilities. So more inclusive, more diverse postgraduate research populations exist in universities who have the least access to doctoral funding. And that the dial hasn't shifted on that in real terms, in terms of where the money's going, even though the partnerships and the collaborations look a bit more inclusive for now. So that might require further exploration. And then just thinking about quality related research degree programme fund allocation in the UK as well. And that's not awarded for professional doctorates. So it's not awarded to institutions for professional doctorates. So if we want to diversify the types of people who are doing doctoral education and participating in doctoral programmes, you know, are there sort of baked in inequalities in the system and disincentives for universities to create more inclusive and more diverse portfolios of different kinds of doctorates if the funding's not going to be available for those? And then finally, just thinking about this kind of shift, this broadening of remit. So clear finding in the report, 41% of respondents now supporting early career researchers specifically alongside postgraduate researchers, and 27% supporting research staff. So I think this probably reflects a shift in focus in policy and practice towards people being at the heart of research, and it poses a question, I think, about whether graduate schools are well positioned to drive change in research culture more widely than just the postgraduate researcher community, and whether it's preferable to have a whole researcher community, sort of PhD to professor continuum in research training and development or not. And you know, it just seems that there's a movement, there's a shift towards taking that kind of broader approach in some institutions, and I'm sort of curious to see whether that will continue.